20% of mail-in voters in 2020 committed at least one act of fraud. Astonishing, yes? So how concerned are you going forward into the 2024 elections that it will be conducted in a manner that's fair and with integrity? That is the overwhelming question for this 2024 White House presidential election. And it is the topic of today's Bold and Blunt. I am your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. And before I get into more about election integrity, which is on everybody's minds these days, I want to quickly mention that if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app. At Real Life Network, that is the faith-based news outreach of Pastor Jack Hibbs's church in California. You may also get Bold and Blunt at WashingtonTimes.com, where I would ask you or invite you to sign up to my 3 times a week newsletter. It's called Bold and Blunt with Cheryl Chumley. You can get to it by scrolling to the bottom of WashingtonTimes.com, find the newsletter section, and then find Bold and Blunt with Cheryl Chumley. Click on it and enter your email address. You will get my commentaries that I write all day long at the Washington Times, as well as my Tuesday and Thursday Bold and Blunt podcast delivered right to your email box 3 times a week. What a bargain, right? Happy New Year. And what better way to start the new year than by subscribing to Bold and Blunt, so we can fight these Marxists, these communists in the Democrat Party who want to steal elections and undercut the American constitutional way of life. And one more quick mention, guess what? You can get Bold and Blunt wherever podcasts are offered. Heritage Foundation just asked this all-important question: will elections finally be secure and honest in 2024? A report by Hans von Spakovsky just published January 5th, and that is a very great question. Key takeaways from this report: some states have refused to take any steps to reform their elections. These include ones with Democrat legislatures, wow, what a surprise, such as Hawaii, Nevada, and California. But here's the good news. Overall, Heritage finds in this report, overall, many parts of the country will be in better shape in 2024 than they were in 2020 when it comes to the security of their elections. That's because a lot of people saw with shock and awe how vulnerable our elections were, because everybody was just mailing in ballots, right? They were just dropping off their ballots, giving it to friends to drop into the mailbox. And that just opens the door to Democrats who have no principles upon which to win elections, opens the door for Democrats to conduct all kinds of fraudulent activities. So 2020 is still a question mark in Americans' minds, and rightly so. It's curious, all the courts didn't even want to consider the question of fraud in the 2020 election. They just wanted to move right past it and get right to inauguration time for Joe Biden, because they didn't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. Some courts may have seen it as too hot an issue to deal with. They didn't want to undercut the system. Some courts may have seen it as something that was ridiculous. No fraud, nothing to see here, go home, folks. And other courts, like in Pennsylvania, just didn't want to deal with the glaring evidence of voter fraud that took place in their state. They just wanted to see Joe Biden brought into office. So Heritage Foundation started doing this election integrity scorecard a few years ago. And I just want to run down some of their findings, because they did it state by state. They rated based on a variety of factors. I'm just going to go over the first 3 because those were the ones that awarded the most points. So voter ID implementation, that was the first category that they looked at for individual states. And for states that actually had voter ID laws in place, which is common sense, right? You have to show an ID for everything. You can't buy cigarettes without showing an ID anymore in most states, but you can vote without it. Doesn't make sense. So if they had voter ID laws, that gave the state up to 20 points. The second highest area that they factored in was the accuracy of voter registration lists, which again, common sense provision. Why should, for instance, dead people be allowed to vote? Democrats don't see a problem with that, but most people in America think it's pretty reasonable that you remove dead people's names from voter registration lists. So states that did that regularly were awarded up to 28 points. And the third highest area where states could be given up to 21 points was absentee ballot management. Very interesting, very important category. So the top states, let's look at what Heritage Foundation found in terms of data. Now remember, this is all data driven. It's not who knows whom and which political party is in charge and who owes favors to whom and so forth. Data driven. So state of Tennessee, number one in terms of advancing election integrity throughout their system. Now, no state received a score of 100, right? No state maxed out at 100 points, but Tennessee got 90 points. Second, and this is very interesting. If you're a big fan and follower of Donald Trump, which I have to include myself in that category, but very interesting because Georgia has come under fire by conservatives, by Republicans, by Donald Trump supporters and so forth. But in terms of cleaning up, at least since 2021, when Heritage Foundation started doing this scorecard, in terms of cleaning up, Georgia comes in at number 2 on the election integrity scorecard with a score of 83. Interesting, right? Number 3, Oklahoma. Number 4, South Carolina. Number 5, it is a 3-way tie for number 5. Alabama, Arkansas, and Missouri all scored 80 on the election integrity scorecard, 80 out of a max 100, of course. Florida comes in as the next state on the list of election integrity scorecard, of scoring high on the election integrity scale. The 8th state, Florida, with a score of 79. The 9th states, again, a tie, Louisiana and Texas, so 9th and 10th states, with a score of 77. And then if you want to go down into the next category, the 11 through 20 states, Indiana scored 76, Ohio and Wisconsin tied with 74, Kentucky scored at 73, Iowa at 72. So improvements are being made. Heritage does have an optimistic outlook about the upcoming election because many states did indeed take action to square away their voter rolls and their election integrity models and systems and so forth. That doesn't mean that Democrats aren't going to try, give it the old college try to do what they can to skew votes, to commit acts of fraud, mostly by pushing for more and more mail-in balloting. I have a big issue with mail-in balloting, and I have a big issue with election day being turned into election week, election weeks, election month, because I think that if you can't be bothered by traveling in person to vote on a single election day, then perhaps you aren't taking the entire process, the entire privilege, the right and responsibility that was so hard fought for in this nation. Perhaps you aren't taking it as seriously as you ought. I don't want people just tossing off a ballot in the mail in between writing their Christmas thank you notes and heading off to the dentist office. I want them to be educated on the candidates. I want them to put some thought into their votes and their candidates. I want them to put enough effort, at least into voting, as they do into getting up and going to work out at the gym, which we all know, right? Half of you guys out there make these these New Year's resolutions about losing weight, and come on, by the time February rolls around, we're looking forward a little bit too much to the Valentine's Day candy, especially the sales that come on February 15th. So if you put effort into going to the gym each day, at least for January, the month of January, then you can put effort into going to the polls one day, one voting day a season. It's not that difficult. Now, if you're elderly, if you have a handicap, and definitely if you're a member of the military, of course mail-in balloting works. That's what it's there for. But it's not for the people who just can't be bothered to go stand in line. Those people, my opinion, shouldn't even vote. Just stay home. Do us all a favor, because we already know you're the low information voter. You're just tossing a ballot in the mail because somebody knocked on your door and told you that you should. So don't vote. Do us all a favor. Anyhow, back to this election integrity report from the Heritage Foundation. And just out of curiosity, right? Don't we all want to know who are the absolute worst states? And so scroll down, which I'm doing, and we start getting into the yellow zone, Idaho, Maryland, both with scores of 54, getting into the orange zone, Colorado, score of 50, Maine, score of 50, and down into the red zone, Illinois, score of 47. New Jersey, score of 45. New York, 45. Massachusetts, 44. Washington, 40. Oregon, 38. Vermont, 38. California, 30. There's a shocker, right? Nevada, 28. And the absolute worst on the list for election integrity, ding, 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 Hawaii. Birthplace, I heard, of Barack Obama. Anyhow, so let's talk about mail-in balloting, because that is the biggest issue going forward. I think we should do away with it. I think that it should only be allowed in very, very, very extreme circumstances, such as what I just mentioned. And I have a guest today who actually is part and parcel of this organization, the Heartland Institute. Great group. Check it out, heartland.org. They do some amazing work. But he's part of this organization who partnered with Rasmussen Reports to determine the level of fraud of mail-in voters in the 2020 election. That's right, the 2020 election that is still an alarm bell in many Americans' minds. His name is Jim Lakely. He is the Vice President and Director of Communications for Heartland Institute, and I'm very happy to say he's on Bold and Blunt right now. Jim, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. It is so great to have you here.
It's great to be with you, Cheryl.
So the Heartland Institute, along with Rasmussen Reports, found that, and I'm quoting from the press release here, 1 in 5 voters who cast mail-in ballots during the 2020 presidential election admit to participating in at least one kind of voter fraud. That is alarming, to say the least.
Yeah, we did this poll, and I got to be honest, we thought, what if it's a dud? How do you gauge how much voter fraud is going on? Because who is going to say, oh yeah, you don't call them up on the phone and say, hey, did you commit an act of voter fraud? Of course they're going to say no. But the way to go about it is to ask about specific activities involving your mail-in ballot in the 2020 election. And so we asked, hey, did you vote in a state using a mail-in ballot in which you are no longer a permanent resident? 17% of mail-in voters said they did. That's voter fraud. That's illegal. You're not supposed to do that. We asked, hey, did you fill out a ballot for a friend or a family member? That's also not legal, and except in very narrow circumstances. 21% of people who mailed in votes in the 2020 election said they did that. We asked, hey, did you sign a ballot for a friend or a family member with or without his or her permission? It's hard to get more obvious voter fraud than that. 17% of people in the 2020 election who mailed in their votes said they had done that.
Wow. And
then we even asked, hey, did somebody offer to pay you or offer you some kind of reward for voting in the 2020 election? 8% of likely voters in this Rasmussen poll who mailed in their ballots in 2020 said yes, I was offered pay or a reward for voting in 2020. Election laws don't allow that. Some election laws in some states, you can't even pass out water to people waiting in line because that's considered undue influence over their vote in the election. So when you take this all together, these are people that they may have done it on purpose. They may have known they were committing an act of voter fraud. They may have just done it innocently. But it is quite clear that a large number of ballots that were mailed in for the election of president in the year 2020 should have been thrown out because they were illegal ballots, because they were fraud or they were crimes. And this is just remarkable that no other organization than the Heartland Institute and Rasmussen even thought to explore this question with the American people.
Was it a large enough percentage that the votes for Joe Biden bringing him into office should have been for Donald Trump? Was it a large enough percentage that Donald Trump has a point that he won the election?
I think it is. I mean, when it's, and as a matter of fact, you just kind of, you're allowing me to hint to something else that the Heartland Institute has coming up, Cheryl. And we're actually taking the results of this poll, and we are applying it to the swing states that were so narrowly decided in the 2020 election. I believe, just off the top of my head, I believe Georgia was 10,000 or so votes. Arizona was similar. Wisconsin, I believe, was about 10 or 15,000 votes. And in those states, you can gather information, some from official state offices and some from polling that the Associated Press had done based on, how many people had mailed in their ballots. Most states actually have records of the total vote in the 2020 presidential election and how many were mail-in ballots as opposed to how many people showed up at the polls, and also how many of those mail-in ballots were Democratic ballots or Republican ballots. And so we are in the process of actually examining those the mail-in voting rates in those states and seeing basically what is the level of fraud that would have turned the election one way or the other. So we're not quite ready to release that information, but I think that's going to make it even more clear that this did have a huge effect on the presidential election, and I think it's time we started talking about it openly without being silenced by the powers that be and by our ruling class. Because if you do not have a fair election, you don't have a democracy. You don't have a republic. And we're not selecting our rulers. We are merely ruled.
Did you ask, as part of the survey to respondents, for them to identify who they voted for in 2020? Was that part of the returns you got?
It's in the standard Rasmussen polling, and they look for likely voters. So likely voters, I suppose, in the 2024 election. So if you're likely to vote in the 2024 election, you certainly almost certainly you had voted in the 2020 election, which was the biggest voter participation in American history. And Rasmussen routinely asks, well, are you a registered Republican or are you a registered Democrat? So yes, it is broken down, and you can see all of that if you go to heartland.org right now and it'll be up there for a long time. If you go to our homepage, you can see the breakdowns for yourself.
So I just want to throw this out there so you can clear it up. Heartland Institute is a libertarian-leaning nonprofit. How would you respond to those people who say, well, Heartland Institute is definitely biased and so forth and has a decided interest in skewing the poll results to show fraud in elections, particularly when it comes to Democrats?
Well, that's not the case. We truly just wanted to know what the level. We wanted to try to figure out a way with Rasmussen, a very reputable polling company, and they would not have just asked any question that we had come up with. We did it with them, and they said these are the kinds of you have to phrase it this way. This is unbiased and all of that. The results speak for themselves. I mean, these people. Because I guess they're anonymous, a stranger called them up on the phone and asked them if they had done this act or this act or this act with their mail-in ballot, and they admitted that yes. And a very disturbingly large number of people said yes, they did these things. Again, my biggest concern, not biggest concern, but one of my concerns when we commissioned this poll, again, was like, well, what if it turns out a dud? I mean, that would have been good. That would have been actually really fantastic news. If we would have gotten results back that said maybe 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 of people who mailed in their ballots in 2020 had either on purpose or inadvertently committed an act of voter fraud, I would have been very pleased with that. Because then, and we would have been pleased to release it to the world, because that would put to rest these sort of ideas that the election was stolen by hook and by crook. We need to have confidence in our elections as Americans. And unfortunately, the troubling thing is that this poll, this survey through Rasmussen and the Heartland Institute, shows that there is a lot of reason to not have confidence in the integrity of our elections.
So I've spoken with a lot of people who've tracked the election of 2020 and have found similar causes for concern about the final result. And the bigger theme here, though, is mail-in balloting. And whoever I ask, the answer is always the same. I ask the question, do you think it's time that we stop mail-in balloting, except in extreme circumstances, such as it used to be? Somebody is elderly or sick and can't get to the polls, or a military member. And by and large, everybody tells me, well, that would be nice, but we've moved past that. What do you say to this?
We can't move past that. Frankly, it's been one election. France does not allow any mail-in balloting. I suppose if you're a French citizen and you're not well enough to get to the polls, you're pretty much out of luck. You don't get to participate in your in the selection of your leaders in the country of France. And so our election laws they were all thrown out the window. Everybody knows this. Based on a pandemic that we were sold, is killing millions and millions of people. It's so contagious and dangerous that we can't possibly have people walking to a polling place or driving to a polling place, standing in line, being anywhere near other people to participate in the selection of their next president. And so state after state, they threw out all the laws. They made them up on the fly. They mailed everybody ballots. In most cases, they threw out the signature checking requirements and all this stuff. We absolutely upended a relatively secure way to vote in this country and threw it all out for a completely, as we see here, a system that has no checks, has really no integrity at all. And I think one good thing that can and must come out of the results of this survey that Heartland and Rasmussen did is that states have to see this, and they should be sobered up by now, and that we have to get rid of mail-in balloting. I mean, you cannot allow our presidents to be selected in this way. The opportunities for fraud, inadvertent or not, is enormous, and that's what this poll shows. 20% of the mail-in ballots had some sort of voter fraud involved with them. That just cannot continue, or we don't really have a country anymore.
Yeah, see, it concerns me when I hear even conservatives say, well, we've moved past that, because as you point out, that is the fight that we should be making. Because don't you think even before COVID, we were on an alarming path in this country of mail-in balloting becoming a thing of convenience, and election day being stretched into election days and election week and so forth?
Yes. Oh, election month. I mean, in a lot of states, they open the polls a month early, and then you can just go at your convenience. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to me. This is supposedly the world's greatest democracy. This is the republic that is a shining city on a hill, an example for every other country around the world that wishes to be free. And we treat the franchise like garbage, like it's worthless. And frankly, I think that's on purpose. Frankly, I think the election of Donald Trump in 2016 was a wake-up call to the ruling class that the American people really they're kind of dangerous. They don't pick the leaders that we approve of. And I think the 2020 election and the throwing out of election rules was part of a strategy by the ruling class to make sure that the American people can't select their leaders anymore that are not approved by them, that is. So, the idea that, hey, mail-in balloting, that's just the way things are, we've moved past that. No. It was a one-time anomaly, and it must remain so. And if you can't bother to show up on Election Day, I mean, this is just my personal opinion, but if you can't bother to show up on Election Day to vote for what we're always told is the most important presidential election in history, if you can't be bothered to show up in person, then you shouldn't be voting. It's too important to leave to the mail. I mean, what if your vote gets lost in the mail? Doesn't anybody care about that? What if when you drop it off in a drop box somewhere that's not secure, aren't you worried that somebody's going to steal your vote? I am. I mean, every single fraudulent vote that is cast takes away the legitimate vote from somebody else. And I take it personally. You know, I want my vote to count. And a single illegal vote cancels me. I'm not okay with that.
Well, thank you for saying that, because too many people seem to be willing to move on and just deal with the status quo instead of fighting for the way it's supposed to be. So let's just finish up by talking about the whys. Democrats, I'm going to go out on a limb and say we know why Democrats are in favor of mail-in balloting, because it enables them to commit acts of fraud. Republicans, maybe in some cases that could be part and parcel of the deciding factor, but I have a theory that Republicans don't want to talk openly about election fraud because they don't want to rock the system. They think that the system is too vulnerable, and if we drag out the truth into the open, the entire system will crumble. What do you think?
One, I think good. Well, why shouldn't a corrupt system crumble? So faster, please. And my other reaction is too bad. Too bad. I mean, we are either a people with the government or it's the other way around. And I want to live in an America where we are a people with the government, not a government that is subjugating the people and does not listen to them, and in fact rigs it so that the system will never lose because the people's voice is actually, in total, mute. And if we don't have secure election systems that the American people have trust in, then what are you preserving? What is the point? It should come down. It should crumble to the ground. And again, faster, please, because we cannot continue in this way. One of the reasons this country is so divided, and the viciousness of the people on each side of the divide just keeps increasing. Part of the reason that is because people feel powerless. They feel like that the whole country is rigged. People on the left and the right. If you were to find a way to put them together, maybe at a sporting event where they won't fight each other because they're the fans of the same team, and you were to ask them if they think the country is broken and they think our elections are legitimate and they think that that this is the country that we're told we have, people on the left and the right would probably agree that it's not. And so that's where we can have that's how we can unify this country. Let's unify around a legitimate election and voting rules that make sense and that minimize fraud as much as possible. We have probably the least secure elections in the Western world. I haven't researched it deeply, but I actually have no doubt in my mind that the United States of America, the greatest democracy in the world, has probably the worst and least secure elections anywhere. That's not in a complete, maybe outside of North Korea. And so if we can't unify around fixing that, then we won't have a country anymore.
Wow. That's astonishing about America, about what your research shows. Jim Lakely, I want to thank you so much for this research and for coming on to discuss it. The Heartland Institute, it's heartland.org, yes?
Yes, it is.
Okay, and the whole survey is posted on the website, you said?
It is.
All right.
It is. And we have more pretty groundbreaking news to come in the coming weeks, so stay tuned.
Okay, I will. I look forward to having you back on to discuss. Jim, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. It was great to speak with you.
Thank you, Cheryl.
If you like Bold and Blunt, don't forget you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at washingtontimes.com, at Real Life Network, and of course, wherever podcasts are offered. Please go to washingtontimes.com and subscribe to my Bold and Blunt newsletter. Tune in next time. In the meanwhile, don't forget, stay blunt, stay bold.